The nurses outside my hospital room spoke Spanish about pulling the plug and thought I was unconscious. The motorcycle accident happened on a Thursday afternoon in early November, when a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of 5th and Madison. I was heading home from my shift at the bookstore, taking my usual route through downtown Portland, when the truck's front bumper caught my rear wheel and sent me flying across 2 lanes of traffic. My helmet cracked against the pavement hard enough to split it down the middle, and the last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of tires squealing and someone screaming. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in what felt like a fog, unable to move or open my eyes but vaguely aware of voices around me and the steady beeping of machines. My name is Daniel Ortega, and I spent 11 days in what doctors called a minimally conscious state, while hospital staff discussed ending my life in Spanish right outside my room, completely unaware that I understood every single word they were saying. The first few days after the accident were a complete blank, just darkness and occasional flashes of sensation that might have been real or might have been dreams. According to the medical records I read later, I was brought into Providence Memorial Hospital with severe head trauma, 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Whitmore, induced a medical coma to reduce brain swelling and give my body time to stabilize. For 72 hours, I was completely hooked up to a ventilator and surrounded by machines monitoring every function. My father flew in from San Diego the day after the accident and barely left my bedside, while my younger sister Lucia drove up from Eugene and spent hours reading to me, even though I couldn't respond. They were told the first week would be critical, that my brain activity was present but minimal, and that there was no way to know if I'd wake up or what condition I'd be in if I did. On day 4, they started reducing the sedation to see if I'd regain consciousness on my own. That's when things got complicated, because I didn't wake up the way they expected. I could hear sounds and feel sensations, but I couldn't open my eyes or move any part of my body. It was like being trapped inside a broken machine, aware of everything happening around me, but unable to signal that I was actually there. The medical term for it is locked-in syndrome, though the doctors didn't realize that's what was happening at first. They assumed I was still deeply unconscious based on my lack of response to stimuli, even though inside my head I was screaming at them to notice I was awake. The first clear memory I have after the accident was hearing my father's voice close to my ear, speaking in English about how strong I was and how I needed to fight. His hand was holding mine, squeezing gently, and I tried with everything I had to squeeze back, but my fingers wouldn't respond to the commands my brain was sending. Dr. Whitmore came by that evening to check on me and explained to my father that my Glasgow Coma Scale score was still very low, indicating minimal brain function. He said the next few days would show whether the swelling had caused permanent damage or if I might gradually improve. I wanted to scream that I could hear him, that I understood every word, but my body remained completely unresponsive. After he left, I heard my father crying quietly beside my bed, and the sound of his grief was worse than any physical pain from my injuries. Lucia arrived shortly after and started reading from 100 Years of Solitude in Spanish, the way our grandmother used to read to us when we were kids. Her voice was soothing and familiar, and I focused on the words, trying to use them as an anchor to stay present instead of drifting back into the fog. She read for almost an hour before a nurse came in to check my vitals and told her visiting hours were ending soon. The nursing staff rotated in 3 shifts, and most of them were professional and kind when they came to turn me or adjust my IV or check the machines. But there were 2 nurses on the night shift who spoke Spanish to each other while they worked, clearly assuming that the unconscious white guy in the bed couldn't understand them. I heard them for the first time on my 5th night in the ICU, their voices carrying from the hallway outside my room as they discussed their patient assignments. One of them, whose voice was higher and younger sounding, complained about having to deal with the vegetable in room 412. That's what she called me, a vegetable. The other nurse, older with a raspier voice, laughed and said, "At least vegetables don't complain or ring the call button every 5 minutes." Their casual cruelty shocked me, but I couldn't do anything except lie there and listen as they continued their conversation just outside my door. The younger nurse, I later learned her name was Carmen from her badge when she leaned over me, came in to adjust my feeding tube and spoke to her colleague in rapid Spanish about how it was a waste of resources keeping people like me alive when the outcome was probably going to be death or permanent vegetation anyway. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was discussing the weather, while her hands efficiently checked the tube placement and recorded numbers on my chart. The older nurse, whose badge read loose, agreed and mentioned that the family was in denial about the prognosis, that they needed to accept he wasn't coming back and let nature take its course. I felt a surge of rage so intense that I tried again to move, to open my eyes, to do anything that would show them I was aware, but my body remained frozen. They finished their tasks and left, and I was alone with the knowledge that my night shift nurses had already written me off as a lost cause not worth saving. Over the next several days, I became more alert inside my paralyzed body, able to track time better and distinguish between different voices and sounds. My father visited every day, usually in the morning before he had to make work calls from the hospital cafeteria. Lucia came in the afternoons and continued reading to me in Spanish, switching between novels and news articles to keep the content varied. Dr. Whitmore stopped by twice daily to check my progress and adjust medications, always speaking to my family in careful, measured tones about realistic expectations and the possibility that I might never regain meaningful consciousness. Meanwhile, the nursing staff continued their routines, some treating me with dignity and care, others talking about me like I was already dead. Carmen and Luz worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I came to dread their arrival each evening because I knew I'd have to listen to them discuss my case in Spanish with the casual callousness of people who'd become desensitized to suffering. On day 8, something changed in the medical team's approach to my care. I heard Dr. Whitmore talking to a colleague outside my room about the costs of long-term ICU care and the ethical considerations of continuing aggressive treatment for patients with poor prognoses. He mentioned that my insurance had already been billed over $200,000 and that the hospital ethics committee might need to get involved soon if I didn't show signs of improvement. His colleague, another doctor whose voice I didn't recognize, suggested that the family should be counseled about palliative care options and the possibility of withdrawing life support. The conversation was in English and carefully worded, but the message was clear. They were starting to give up on me. That night, Carmen and Luz were more explicit in their Spanish discussions outside my room. Carmen said she'd heard the doctors were going to recommend pulling the plug soon, and Luz responded that it was about time because keeping brain-dead patients on machines was just prolonging the inevitable and taking up beds that could go to people who actually had a chance. I felt panic rising in my chest, which was ironic because I couldn't even control my own breathing without the ventilator. They were talking about ending my life based on the assumption that I wasn't aware, that I couldn't hear or understand or feel anything. But I was there, trapped behind the prison of my own body, desperately trying to find a way to communicate that I was still present and fighting. Carmen came into my room to check my catheter, and I heard her tell Luz in Spanish that she gave it another week maximum before the family agreed to disconnect everything. She said families always held on too long, making the patient suffer needlessly when the merciful thing would be to let them go. Her hands were rough as she adjusted the tubing, and I wanted to scream at her that I could feel that I wasn't some inanimate object she could manhandle. She finished her task and left, making a comment in Spanish about how at least I didn't require much work, since I couldn't move or respond to anything. The next morning, my father arrived earlier than usual, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice when he greeted the day shift nurse. He'd been sleeping in the hospital waiting room for over a week, leaving only to shower at a nearby hotel and make necessary phone calls. Lucia had gone back to Eugene temporarily to handle some work obligations, but called multiple times a day for updates. Dr. Whitmore came by during morning rounds and asked my father to step into the hallway for a private conversation. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I caught enough words to understand they were discussing next steps and the possibility of moving me to a long-term care facility if my condition didn't improve. My father's voice cracked when he asked if there was any chance I'd wake up, and Dr. Whitmore's response was carefully non-committal, lots of medical jargon that essentially meant they didn't know but weren't optimistic. After the doctor left, my father came back to my bedside and held my hand in silence for a long time. I could feel the warmth of his palm against mine and the slight trembling of his fingers, and I concentrated every bit of mental energy I had on trying to squeeze back, trying to move even a millimeter to show him I was there. Nothing happened. My hand remained limp and unresponsive, and eventually my father let go and left to make phone calls. I spent the rest of the morning alone, except for periodic nurse visits, practicing in my head how I might move different body parts. I started with my fingers, trying to remember what it felt like to curl them into a fist, then moved to my toes, then my eyelids. Everything stayed frozen, like the connection between my brain and my body had been severed completely. By afternoon, I was exhausted from the mental effort, even though I hadn't physically moved at all. Lucia called and spoke to the day shift nurse, asking for an update on my condition. The nurse, a kind woman named Dorothy, who always explained what she was doing before touching me, gave a gentle but honest assessment that there had been no change in my responsiveness. I heard Lucia crying on the other end of the phone, and Dorothy stayed on the line with her for several minutes, offering comfort and encouragement. That night, Carmen and Luz returned for their shift, and their Spanish conversation outside my room was darker than usual. Carmen mentioned that she'd overheard Dr. Whitmore talking to a social worker about my case, discussing the process for getting family consent to withdraw life support. Luce said she'd seen it happen dozens of times, families clinging to false hope until the medical bills became overwhelming and they finally accepted reality. She described the process in clinical detail, how they'd remove the breathing tube and stop the medications, how death usually came within minutes or sometimes hours depending on the patient's condition. Carmen asked if they'd keep me sedated during the process, and Luce said probably, though sometimes with vegetative patients they didn't bother since there was supposedly no awareness of discomfort. The casual way they discussed my potential death, in Spanish right outside my door, while assuming I couldn't understand, filled me with a terror I'd never experienced before. I had to find a way to communicate, to show them I was conscious and aware. I spent the entire night after they finished their rounds trying different techniques I'd read about in a neuroscience article years ago. I tried to change my breathing pattern, though the ventilator controlled most of that. I tried to move my eyes beneath my closed lids. I tried to twitch any muscle anywhere in my body. Hours passed with no success, and by morning, I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. My father arrived and resumed his usual position beside my bed, talking quietly about nothing important, just filling the silence with the sound of his voice. He mentioned that my boss from the bookstore had called asking about me, and that my apartment rent was paid through the end of the month. Small, practical details that felt both mundane and profound, reminders of the life I'd been living just over a week ago that now seemed impossibly distant. Dr. Whitmore came by late morning with another doctor I'd heard before, an ethics specialist named Dr. Patel. They asked my father to join them in a conference room for a family meeting, and the serious tone of their voices made it clear this wasn't going to be good news. I was left alone with just the machines beeping around me, and I tried once again to move something, anything, to create some visible sign that I was conscious. My right index finger was resting on top of the blanket, and I focused every ounce of concentration on that single finger, imagining it lifting, bending, twitching, any movement at all. Nothing happened. After what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, my father returned to the room, and I could tell immediately from his breathing that he'd been crying. He sat down heavily in the chair beside my bed and took my hand again, holding it between both of his. His voice was thick with emotion when he started speaking in Spanish, addressing me directly for the first time. He said the doctors had told him my brain activity wasn't improving and that the longer I stayed in this state, the less likely I was to recover meaningfully. He said they'd recommended considering palliative care and possibly withdrawing life support to let me go peacefully. He was crying openly now, his tears falling on our joined hands, and he said he didn't know what to do, that he'd promised my mother before she died that he'd always take care of us kids, but he didn't know if keeping me on machines was taking care of me or just prolonging suffering. He begged me, if I could hear him at all, to give him a sign, any sign, that I was still in there fighting. His desperation and pain were overwhelming, and I strained with every fiber of my being to respond, to squeeze his hand or move my finger or open my eyes. For several minutes, nothing happened while he sat there crying and holding my limp hand. Then, so faintly I almost missed it myself, I felt something in my right index finger. Not movement exactly, but a sensation, like the beginning of connection being re-established. I focused on that feeling, nurturing it, encouraging it, trying to amplify it into actual motion. My father was still talking, saying he loved me, and that he'd understand if I needed to let go, that I shouldn't fight for his sake if I was ready to rest. But I wasn't ready, and I wasn't giving up, and I pushed every bit of mental energy I had into that index finger. It moved, just barely, maybe half a centimeter, but it definitely moved against his palm. I felt it, and more importantly, I felt him feel it. His sharp intake of breath told me he'd noticed, and his voice changed immediately, becoming urgent and hopeful. He said my name, asked if I'd moved on purpose, begged me to do it again if I could. I tried, focusing on the same finger, and after several seconds of intense concentration, it twitched again, slightly more pronounced this time. My father started yelling for the nurse, his voice echoing down the hallway, and within seconds Dorothy came rushing in asking what was wrong. He told her my finger had moved, that he'd felt it twice, and she moved to my bedside to check. She asked him to stay quiet and observe while she tested my responses, speaking to me in a clear voice and asking me to move my finger if I could hear her. I concentrated hard and managed another small twitch. Dorothy's professional composure cracked slightly, and she said she'd seen it too, that she was going to page Dr. Whitmore immediately. She left quickly, and my father stayed beside me, holding my hand and talking nonstop in Spanish, encouraging me to keep trying, telling me I was going to be okay. I was exhausted from the effort of moving that one finger, but I'd done it. I'd created a visible sign that I was conscious and aware. Dr. Whitmore arrived within 15 minutes, moving faster than I'd ever heard him move before. He brought another neurologist with him, Dr. Kim, and they performed a series of tests, asking me to move my finger in response to specific questions. Yes meant move once, no meant don't move. Could I hear them? One twitch. Did I know where I was? One twitch. Was I in pain? No movement. Did I understand we were at a hospital? One twitch. The questions went on for almost an hour, and while I couldn't answer them all because the finger movements were exhausting and inconsistent, I managed enough responses to convince them I was genuinely conscious and comprehending. Dr. Whitmore's voice had completely changed from the resignation I'd heard earlier, now filled with excitement and clinical fascination. He told my father this was extraordinary, that I was showing signs of locked-in syndrome rather than true unconsciousness, which changed everything about my prognosis and treatment plan. They scheduled an immediate MRI and additional neurological tests, and suddenly my room was full of activity as nurses prepared to transport me. I heard Dr. Whitmore calling other specialists and describing my case, his voice animated in a way I'd never heard before. Carmen and Luz's shift would be starting in a few hours, and I found myself almost looking forward to their arrival, to the moment when they'd discover that the vegetable they'd been discussing pulling the plug on was actually fully conscious and had understood every word they'd said. But first, I had to get through the battery of tests they were planning. The transportation process was uncomfortable and disorienting, being wheeled through hallways while unable to see or move, hearing snippets of conversation from staff we passed. The MRI machine was loud and claustrophobic, even though I couldn't move to express my discomfort, just had to lie there while it scanned my brain for however long the test required. When they brought me back to my room, my father was waiting with Lucia, who'd driven back up from Eugene as soon as she heard the news. She was crying and holding my hand, speaking rapidly in Spanish about how she'd known I was still there, that she'd felt it when she was reading to me. The doctors explained that the MRI showed significant brain activity in the regions responsible for consciousness and comprehension, confirming that I was aware despite my inability to move or communicate normally. They said locked-in syndrome was rare but well documented, and that with intensive therapy, some patients could regain limited movement and develop alternative communication methods. The prognosis had shifted from terminal to challenging, but potentially manageable, and the entire tone around my care changed immediately. Dr. Whitmore apologized for the earlier discussions about withdrawing support, explaining that without clear signs of consciousness, they'd had no way of knowing I was aware and had assumed I was in a persistent vegetative state. That evening, as visiting hours ended and my family reluctantly left for the night, I waited for Carmen and Luz to arrive for their shift. Dorothy briefed them during the handoff, explaining the dramatic developments with my case and the new diagnosis of locked-in syndrome. I couldn't see their faces, but I heard the change in their voices, suddenly professional and careful, no longer speaking in Spanish about me like I was an inanimate object. Carmen came in to check my vitals and spoke to me directly in English, explaining what she was doing before touching me, her voice notably gentler than the rough efficiency of previous nights. Luz followed shortly after, and also addressed me by name, asking if I needed anything adjusted for comfort. The irony wasn't lost on me that discovering I was conscious had instantly transformed me from a vegetable to a patient deserving of basic dignity and care. Over the next few days, the medical team established a more sophisticated communication system using eye movements, which I'd started to regain limited control over. They set up a board with letters and common words, and I could slowly spell out messages by looking at different positions. It was exhausting and painfully slow, but it was communication, proof that I was a person with thoughts and needs, and not just a body being kept alive by machines. My father stayed by my side constantly, and Lucia took family leave from her job to help coordinate my care. One of the first things I spelled out once I had enough control was a message asking to speak to someone in hospital administration. My father wasn't sure why, but he honored the request and arranged for a patient advocate to visit my room. The advocate, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who'd worked at the hospital for 20 years, introduced herself and explained she was there to address any concerns about my care. Using the eye tracking board, I slowly spelled out a message that took almost 30 minutes to complete. I told her about Carmen and Luz, about their conversations in Spanish outside my room, about how they'd called me a vegetable, and discussed pulling the plug while assuming I couldn't understand them. I explained that I was fluent in Spanish, that I'd heard and understood everything, and that their behavior while I'd been unable to defend myself was completely inappropriate. Patricia's face went pale as she read my laboriously spelled message, and she asked several clarifying questions to make sure she understood correctly. My father, who'd been watching the whole exchange, looked horrified when Patricia explained what I'd communicated. Patricia took detailed notes, including the specific dates and times I remembered their conversations, and assured me this would be investigated immediately. She apologized profusely on behalf of the hospital and promised that appropriate action would be taken. I spelled out that I wasn't trying to get them fired necessarily, but that they needed to understand their patients might be aware even when they appeared unconscious, and that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their condition. Patricia thanked me for coming forward and said this was exactly the kind of feedback that could improve care for other patients in vulnerable situations. After she left, my father held my hand and said he was proud of me for speaking up, that it took courage to report mistreatment when you were still dependent on the same system for your care. The hospital administration moved quickly. Within 2 days, both Carmen and Luz were removed from my care team and placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I learned later from Dorothy that several other patients' families had also complained about Carmen's bedside manner in the past, but nothing had been done because the complaints were always secondhand or subjective. My account was different because I'd understood their Spanish conversations and could provide specific details about what they'd said and when. The investigation expanded to include a review of their patient care records and interviews with other staff members. Dorothy mentioned that the incident had sparked a larger conversation about patient dignity and the assumptions staff sometimes made about unconscious or unresponsive patients. My recovery was slow but steady. After 2 weeks, I'd regained enough muscle control to breathe on my own, and they removed the ventilator, which felt like a victory, even though I still couldn't speak. Physical and occupational therapists worked with me daily, helping me relearn basic movements that most people took for granted. My right hand was the first to show significant improvement, progressing from single finger twitches to being able to grip objects weakly. Speech therapy started once I could control my facial muscles enough to attempt forming words, though my voice was hoarse and barely audible at first. Every small milestone felt monumental after spending days completely trapped inside my paralyzed body. My father documented everything, taking photos and videos that he said we'd look back on someday as evidence of how far I'd come. 3 weeks after the accident, I was transferred out of ICU to a regular hospital room, which felt like graduating to a new level of recovery. The room had a window with actual sunlight, and my family could visit during extended hours without the strict ICU restrictions. Lucia brought my laptop and set up a text-to-speech program that I could control with eye movements, giving me a much faster way to communicate than spelling things out letter by letter. The technology wasn't perfect, but being able to generate full sentences and have conversations at a semi-normal pace was incredibly freeing. I used it to thank the nurses who'd treated me with kindness, even when they thought I couldn't perceive it, and to chat with friends who visited and needed reassurance that I was still myself, despite the physical limitations. The hospital's investigation into Carmen and Luz concluded after 3 weeks. Patricia came to my room to update me on the outcome, explaining that both nurses had been terminated for violations of patient dignity and professional conduct standards. The specific Spanish conversations I'd reported had been corroborated by checking which patients they'd been assigned to on those nights and matching my timeline to their shift logs. Other staff members had also come forward during the investigation with their own concerns about the 2 nurses' attitudes toward certain patients. Patricia said the hospital was implementing new training programs for all staff about locked-in syndrome and the importance of maintaining professional behavior around all patients, regardless of their apparent consciousness level. She thanked me again for speaking up and said my experience would likely prevent similar situations with other vulnerable patients. I had mixed feelings about the outcome. Part of me felt guilty that 2 people had lost their jobs because of my report, but a larger part recognized that their behavior had been genuinely harmful and could have resulted in my death if I hadn't found a way to communicate. They'd discussed withdrawing my life support while I was fully conscious and aware, treating me like an inconvenient object rather than a human being. That wasn't acceptable regardless of the circumstances, and other patients deserved better care than what Carmen and Luz had been providing. My father said I'd done the right thing, that accountability was important, especially in healthcare settings where patients were often powerless to advocate for themselves. Lucia agreed and pointed out that if Carmen and Luz had been comfortable saying those things about me, they'd probably said similar things about other patients who truly were unconscious and would never be able to report it. By the end of my 4th week in the hospital, I'd regained enough function to feed myself with assistance and to speak in short sentences, though my voice was still weak and my words sometimes slurred. The neurological team was cautiously optimistic about my continued recovery, though they emphasized that locked-in syndrome was unpredictable, and I might always have some level of physical limitation. I was scheduled to transfer to an intensive rehabilitation facility where I'd spend several months working on regaining as much independence as possible. The physical therapy sessions were brutal, requiring me to relearn movements my body had forgotten how to perform, but I pushed through them with determination, fueled partly by the memory of lying paralyzed while nurses discussed ending my life. That experience had given me a fierce appreciation for every tiny bit of autonomy I could reclaim. Dr. Whitmore came to check on me one last time before my transfer, and we had a conversation using my text-to-speech program about everything that had happened. He apologized again for the initial discussions about withdrawing support, explaining that medical ethics in cases of severe brain injury were incredibly complex and that doctors had to make difficult decisions with incomplete information. I understood his position intellectually, but emotionally, it was still difficult to reconcile that the same doctors who'd saved my life had also seriously considered ending it. He acknowledged that discomfort and said it was why my case would be used as a teaching example in medical ethics courses, an illustration of why doctors needed to be extremely cautious about assumptions regarding patient consciousness. He promised to follow my recovery progress and said he hoped to see me walking into his office someday under my own power. The rehabilitation facility was intense but effective. I worked with therapists 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, gradually rebuilding strength and coordination in my muscles. My speech improved significantly within the first month, going from barely audible whispers to relatively normal conversation with only occasional slurring. My fine motor control came back slower, but by month 3, I could type on a keyboard and handle basic self-care tasks without assistance. The occupational therapist said I was an unusually motivated patient, and I told her about lying paralyzed and listening to nurses discuss pulling my plug, which she said explained a lot about my drive to recover. Walking was the biggest challenge because my balance and coordination had been severely affected, but with leg braces and a walker, I managed my first independent steps 4 months after the accident. My father and Lucia visited every week, bringing news from the outside world and encouragement when the therapy sessions became overwhelming. Friends from the bookstore sent cards and videos, and my boss assured me my job would be waiting whenever I was ready to return. The psychological aspects of recovery were almost as challenging as the physical ones, dealing with PTSD from the accident and from the experience of being trapped in my body. The facility's psychologist specialized in trauma, and our sessions helped me process the fear and anger I felt about everything that had happened. She said locked-in syndrome survivors often struggled with trust issues in medical settings, and I certainly fit that pattern, becoming anxious whenever healthcare workers spoke in languages other than English around me. 6 months after the accident, I was discharged from the rehabilitation facility with a walker and instructions for continuing outpatient therapy. I moved in with my father temporarily while I worked on regaining full independence, and Lucia came up from Eugene most weekends to help with tasks I still struggled with. The motorcycle was a total loss, and I had no intention of ever riding again, but I'd survived with my cognitive function intact and a decent chance of eventually living independently. My case had become somewhat known in medical circles, discussed in journals and at conferences as an example of locked-in syndrome with successful recovery. Dr. Kim, the neurologist who'd done my initial testing, asked if I'd be willing to participate in a research study about conscious awareness in apparently unconscious patients, and I agreed, hoping my experience might help improve diagnostic techniques. The bookstore welcomed me back for limited hours after 7 months, and being able to work again, even just a few shifts a week, felt like reclaiming a piece of my pre-accident identity. Customers who'd heard about what happened would sometimes ask questions, and I'd gotten comfortable with a brief explanation about the accident and recovery. What I didn't usually mention was the part about the nurses discussing pulling my plug in Spanish, assuming I couldn't understand. That detail felt too personal and complex to share casually, though I did talk about it in therapy and occasionally with close friends. It had fundamentally changed how I viewed medical care and patient advocacy, making me much more aware of how vulnerable people in hospitals truly were. Carmen and Luz's termination had been the talk of the hospital nursing staff for weeks, according to Dorothy, who stayed in touch with periodic updates. Some nurses had been shocked by their behavior, while others had defended them, saying they'd just been venting and hadn't meant any real harm. That division bothered me because it suggested some healthcare workers still didn't fully grasp that unconscious or unresponsive patients might be aware and deserving of the same respect as alert patients. The hospital's new training program was supposedly addressing that issue, but changing institutional culture took time. I hoped that my willingness to report what I'd experienced might make at least some staff members think twice before assuming their patients couldn't hear or understand them. A year after the accident, I attended a support group for locked-in syndrome survivors and families, something my psychologist had recommended. The group met monthly at a community center, and I was surprised by how many members there were, people at various stages of recovery or living with permanent limitations. Hearing their stories and sharing mine created a sense of community I hadn't realized I needed. Many of them had experienced similar issues with medical staff making assumptions about their awareness, and several had stories about inappropriate conversations they'd overheard while appearing unconscious. One man described hearing his own wife discuss whether to divorce him while he was supposedly in a vegetative state, a betrayal that had poisoned their relationship even after his recovery. A woman talked about nurses making crude jokes about her appearance while bathing her, comments she'd heard and remembered, despite having no way to respond at the time. These stories reinforced that my experience with Carmen and Luz wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem in how some healthcare workers viewed and treated incapacitated patients. The support group discussed strategies for patient advocacy and ways to educate medical staff about the possibility of hidden consciousness. Several members had become involved in efforts to improve hospital protocols, and I found myself joining them at a hospital ethics board meeting to share our perspectives. Speaking publicly about my experience was nerve-wracking, but I managed to explain clearly what it had been like to be fully conscious while staff discussed ending my life, and how their assumption that I couldn't understand Spanish had led to conversations that no patient should have to overhear about themselves. The ethics board seemed genuinely affected by the testimony, and several members asked thoughtful questions about how they could better protect vulnerable patients. One board member mentioned that they were considering implementing a policy requiring all patient discussions, even in staff lounges or hallways, to be conducted with the assumption that patients or family members might overhear and understand regardless of language or apparent consciousness level. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step toward cultural change. Another member suggested regular training updates that included stories from patients like me, first-hand accounts of what hidden consciousness felt like, and how staff behavior had impacted our recovery and well-being. My physical recovery plateaued around the 18-month mark, leaving me with some permanent limitations, but overall good function. I could walk without assistance, though I tired easily, and my fine motor control was good enough for most daily tasks. My speech was almost completely normal, except when I was very tired or stressed. The neurological team said this was probably as close to full recovery as I'd get, that the remaining deficits were likely permanent due to the severity of my initial brain injury. I'd made peace with that, grateful for what I'd regained, rather than dwelling on what was lost. The fact that I'd survived at all, much less with my cognitive abilities intact, felt like a miracle when I thought about how close I'd come to having life support withdrawn while I was fully conscious inside my paralyzed body. My father eventually admitted that he'd been hours away from signing the papers to withdraw life support when my finger had twitched. Dr. Whitmore had scheduled a family meeting for that afternoon to finalize the decision, and my father had spent the morning praying for a sign, any indication of whether he was making the right choice. He said feeling my finger move against his palm had been the clearest answer to prayer he'd ever received, and he'd never doubted since that moment that I was going to survive. Lucia said she'd always felt my presence when she read to me in Spanish, that she'd sensed I was listening even when the doctors insisted I was unconscious. Looking back, I realized how fortunate I'd been that my family hadn't given up sooner, that I'd regained the ability to communicate before the ethics committee meeting that Dr. R. Whitmore had mentioned. The settlement from the motorcycle accident provided enough financial cushion that I didn't have to rush back to full-time work, giving me space to focus on recovery and advocacy work. I started speaking at nursing schools and medical conferences about patient dignity and the importance of never assuming unconsciousness means unawareness. The talks were emotionally draining but felt important, like taking something terrible that had happened and using it to potentially improve care for others. Students always had thoughtful questions, and I appreciated their genuine interest in learning from my experience. Some shared stories about clinical rotations where they'd witnessed staff making assumptions about unresponsive patients, and several said my talk had changed how they'd approach patient care in their future careers. Carmen and Luz never reached out to apologize, and I didn't expect them to. Patricia from the hospital administration mentioned that both had found work at other facilities, though presumably with the termination on their records, future employers would ask questions. I hoped the experience had taught them something about patient dignity, but I'd never know for sure. What I did know was that their behavior, while hurtful and inappropriate, had ultimately motivated me to advocate for better patient care standards. If they'd treated me with basic respect and dignity during those 11 days when I was locked in and vulnerable, I might not have become involved in healthcare advocacy at all. Sometimes the worst experiences push people toward their most meaningful work. 2 years after the accident, I was invited to speak at Providence Memorial Hospital's staff appreciation event, which felt surreal given that I'd been a patient there fighting for my life. The invitation came from Dr. Whitmore, who explained that the hospital wanted to acknowledge how my case had transformed their approach to patient care and consciousness assessment. I accepted, though I was nervous about returning to the place where I'd experienced such trauma. Walking through the hospital entrance with my father beside me for support, I remembered being wheeled through these hallways on a gurney, unable to move or see but hearing everything around me. The ICU floor looked different from a mobile perspective, and several nurses from my time there recognized me and stopped to chat, marveling at my recovery. My speech at the event focused on the importance of treating every patient with dignity, regardless of their apparent consciousness level, and I shared specific examples from my time in the locked-in state. I mentioned hearing staff members discuss my prognosis in ways that assumed I couldn't understand, and how isolating and terrifying that had been. I thanked the nurses and doctors who'd treated me with respect and kindness, even when they thought I couldn't perceive it, and I acknowledged that healthcare workers face enormous stress and challenges that can lead to compassion fatigue. But I emphasized that patients are always deserving of basic human dignity, and that the words spoken around them matter even when they can't respond. The room was completely silent when I finished, and several staff members approached afterward to thank me for sharing my story and to promise they'd remember my words when caring for future patients. Dr. Whitmore pulled me aside before I left and mentioned that the hospital had implemented several policy changes directly because of my case. All staff now received annual training on locked-in syndrome and hidden consciousness. Patient discussions were required to be conducted as if the patient could hear and understand, and they'd improved their neurological assessment protocols to catch signs of awareness more quickly. He said my willingness to report what I'd experienced with Carmen and Luce, despite the potential awkwardness of remaining under the same hospital's care, had been the catalyst for meaningful institutional change. He hoped I felt proud of that legacy, because the policies I'd influenced would protect countless future patients in vulnerable situations. Looking back from the perspective of 2 years, the entire experience felt both distant and intensely present. I'd survived a traumatic accident, endured 11 days trapped in my own body, overheard medical staff discussing ending my life, found a way to communicate my awareness, reported serious misconduct despite being dependent on the same system, and spent months relearning basic functions most people never think about. The journey had been exhausting and terrifying and painful, but it had also given me purpose and perspective I'd never had before. I understood vulnerability in a way most people fortunately never would, and that understanding made me more empathetic to others facing medical challenges or depending on caregivers for basic needs. My story had a relatively happy ending, successful recovery and meaningful advocacy work, and policy changes that would help others. But I never forgot how easily it could have gone differently, how close I'd come to having my life support withdrawn while I was fully conscious and aware. That knowledge stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death could be, and how critical it was that healthcare workers maintained their compassion and professionalism even in the most challenging circumstances. The nurses outside my hospital room had spoken Spanish about pulling the plug, confident that I couldn't understand. They'd been wrong about that, and their mistake had ultimately led to positive changes in how vulnerable patients were treated. Sometimes the universe provided teachable moments in the most unexpected and difficult ways, and it was up to us to learn from them and do better going forward. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.